Welcome to Vermont's Voice, your source for the public interest conversation in the State House and beyond. I'm your host, Jordan Hayden. Now, we've got a very special guest for you all today, Falko Schilling, who has been working to promote positive social change in Vermont since 2009. He officially joined the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU of Vermont, as its first Advocacy Director in July 2019. Before that, he spent 5 years leading winning legislative and grassroots campaigns here at VPIRG, including Vermont's GMO labeling campaign. There is so much more I could say, but let's just get right into it because there is a whole lot to discuss. This is Vermont's Voice.
Well, hey, Jordan, how was your weekend?
It was pretty good, Eli. I stayed nice and busy. How about you?
Same. I think we had a little bit of overlap.
Yes, perhaps on Saturday.
Yeah. I hear there was a pretty big rally on the State House lawn.
Yes, the Hands Off rally, which took place from roughly 12 to 3. And that was a great time. I'm excited to talk to you about that. But first, I do want to talk about what happened here at the VPIRG office.
Some great grassroots action.
Yes. So if... Again, kind of not a great character of crowd size. I say this all the time. But I think there were roughly 45 folks in the room. Would you agree?
It was pretty tightly packed. We had a whole bunch of folks over for some sign making and snacks and coffee and vegan hot chocolate.
Yes.
And it was just such like a heartwarming display of community and everybody helping each other out and giving ideas for their signs. And we'll put up some photos from there. If you look at our Instagram, there's some there as well, but maybe we'll get a little montage of our favorite signs going.
Yeah. And there was a good playlist, might I add.
Great playlist, yes.
But yeah, I really valued that sort of community building time. There were a lot of folks in the room that didn't know each other and that I didn't know. So just in our outreach of this, I think it was kind of going in various directions, like folks sharing with their friends, their family, people that we never had a chance to meet before. So I'm hoping we can do more stuff like that in the future.
For sure. Yeah, it's always interesting when people who have never heard of VPIRG show up to VPIRG events, and then we get to tell them all the cool stuff we do and get them involved and get them taking action. And definitely, Good feels.
Yeah, definitely warmed my heart. And again, want to do more of that. So I'm sure there will be more opportunities. We'll see what happens. But obviously, that was just a small part of the day. We headed over to the State House lawn shortly after that for the actual rally itself. And a lot was kind of going on there.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. So according to WCAX and VT Digger, there was somewhere between 10 and 15,000 in Montpelier. Now, to me, that seems like a lot, but again, I have no concept. When I see people in space, I don't know. So maybe that's true. I don't know. What do you?
My frame of reference for stuff like this is always the big women's march in Trump's first term. And that was, I believe, around 20,000 people on the State House lawn. Like literally you couldn't see a blade of grass. There were that many people. So this wasn't quite as big, but it was close. So when they say 10 to 15,000, I'm inclined to believe that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, we certainly talked to many folks, not that many, but we had a time and table set up and just like all of our sort of general materials and swag. And it was really nice to, again, like hit on that community building and action component.
And people came out despite the weather. I don't know if you were there, it was like freezing and raining the whole time and kind of muddy and gross. But Vermonters are pretty pissed off right now.
Yeah, the weather was terrible, but what's going on in the world is even more terrible.
Absolutely. I was able to catch up actually with Senator Peter Welch right after he gave his big speech to the crowd, and he recorded a nice little video for us about why he was there that day, and we'll throw that up on screen right now for you viewers at home.
Great to be here with thousands of Vermonters standing up for our democracy. Trump is a threat. He's on a lawless rampage, tearing apart our Constitution, wrecking our economy, disrespecting civil rights of all our people. We've got to unite. It's got to be bottom up, and we're seeing the strength of the voice of Vermont right here today.
So really inspiring words from Senator Welch. That clip actually went a little viral on our social media, which is always exciting for me. Not to toot my own horn.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was great. And I'm so glad that you were able to capture that. And I thought that Treasurer Mike Piechek's speech was really good.
Oh, he was fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, granted, everyone I heard, was pretty good. But I think it was just so cool because he was in here like literally a few days prior to his speech. And so, I don't know, just the dichotomy of that was kind of fascinating to me. And again, it was truly so powerful. And I never heard him speak in that way. So I'm glad that we captured some of that. I don't know if we also want to share a clip for it. Is this too many clips? Is it worth, I don't know.
We'll put something up.
All right, we'll put it up.
It's wrong to grab a young, tough student off the street for no reason other than protesting the administration. It's wrong to round people up on the streets with no evidence of a crime, no hearing, and send them off to a foreign prison. We are here to say loudly and clearly, hands off our neighbors. It's wrong to start a senseless trade war against our friends and allies. As a member of the LGBTQ plus community who married his husband this past summer, I'm here to say, get your hands off our marriage. I want to stand here for our transgender friends to say, get your hands off our healthcare choices. These policies are not policy failures. These things are wrong because they are moral failures. We have a moral obligation to take action over apathy.
Like you mentioned, he was here just the day before, 2 days before.
Yeah.
That episode's out right now, so you should definitely go watch it. But I'm willing to say that you might have warmed him up a little bit. Prepared him for his
I'll take the credit for that. I'm sure he'd love to hear that I'm taking credit for his speech.
Please come back on our show.
Yes, too.
But yeah, this is an interesting moment that we're in right now. It seems like there's a lot of chaos. We may be putting tariffs on the entire world. We may not be. It's kind of changing by the hour.
Are you very tired of talking about tariffs?
I am
Because
sick of tariffs.
Sick of
and
tariffs.
I don't think we're going to be able to stop talking about it.
No, it's not. I know.
But tariffs are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of other really messed up things happening in Vermont and nationwide due to this, new federal administration. And you actually sat down with somebody pretty interesting to talk about them.
Yes, Falko Schilling, who is with the ACLU of Vermont. We had a really great conversation about just what you're talking about, all of the terrible things that are happening in Vermont and in many cases beyond Vermont. So I think it's a really valuable episode. And not that it surprised me, but there were just so many calls to action that I think people are really looking for right now. So I hope there's some value in that. There are many ways that you can plug in and get involved on a variety of very important issues that are happening here. So really meaningful, important episode that I hope folks will listen to.
Yeah, I was sitting on the other side and listening the whole time, and I came away thinking, well, there's bad things happening, but we've got some really smart people working on it right now. So I took away a message of hope, even though
Me too.
A lot of doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Listen to the rest of the episode. Great interview.
Yeah, enjoy it. Well, Falko, thank you so much for being here and welcome to Vermont's Voice.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be back here.
Yeah, I bet, because you used to work here at VPIRG. And so I imagine that this space to you might look a little different from what you remember, right? Is that true?
I mean, surprisingly, it doesn't look all that different, other than all the lights and the whole setup here. But a lot of things look surprisingly the same. I think you got some new carpeting in here, but walking around, it brought back a lot of memories. So it's good to be back
to some past campaigns, possibly.
Lots of work, lots of time in this office.
Yeah,
lots of good stuff.
Well, there are certainly many things from your time that still exist in this office today. And I found one that I wanted to show you.
Oh, man.
It's right around the corner here. Does this ring any bells for you?
Oh, yeah. No, that rings a bell.
And I'm just going to quickly share it with our audience here and our listeners, because not everybody, watches the podcast. So I'm just going to quickly read what it says here. This is an article from the Burlington Free Press back from 2014. There's a picture of you on it. And it says, GMO law is a go. the Vermont House votes overwhelmingly to require the labeling of foods containing genetically modified organisms. Governor Shumlin says he'll sign the bill, making Vermont the first state with the mandate. So that's pretty cool.
It was pretty great. Seeing that above the fold was exciting. And I don't know, I guess at that point I was still in my mid-20s, first couple of years doing this work up in the State House. You see former Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman in that bear hug pretty much. It's hard to see much of him because it's quite a bear hug. But no, that's one of those memories and one of those things it's hard to forget. And capture a moment like that. That was a really exciting day because that bill, with the legislative biennium, the first year we got it through the House and then got it through the Senate. And so that was a culmination of more than 2 years, but that bill in particular, 2 years of work and a lot of behind the scenes work, incredible amount of organizing, especially with the canvas, to get it to where it was today. And that was a huge moment of relief. It's not often that you have a professional photographer there right. to capture that. I remember when it came out, just the amount of folks that were writing me and showing me pictures of that. So we had to go out and get a number of copies, and I still have one in my office too. So
that's cool.
One of my favorite clippings that's out there.
Yeah, it's a great one, and I'm so glad that we could touch a little bit on your work. I alluded to it in the intro, but obviously it was before my time. So really excited to have you here, who played such a significant role with that campaign, and to be the first in the country to pass that kind of legislation. Just super meaningful. So
yeah, and it was, back in my time here at VPIRG, I was a consumer protection advocate, which was great, and I think set me up well for a lot of the future work I've ended up doing, because so much of that is focusing on protecting folks' rights, but also working in a really wide range of issues, working in many different committees, working with different constituencies. So really, my foot in the door was starting to work on the GMO labeling campaign, which is focused on consumer rights and a right to know.
Right.
And it was just a time when it was the political landscape was ready for it and folks were excited. There were real concerns about what was in our food, concerns about how our food is produced, especially with the use of really dangerous chemicals and what impact that's having on our ecosystem and the food itself. And was able to build off of a lot of organizing that had happened before then. But as I reflect on it, one of the things that I think about often is I was lucky I didn't know what I didn't know at that time. Sometimes as like a young organizer and advocate, it helps to just believe fully that you're going to get this done without knowing all the possible hurdles you might run into, all the possible pitfalls. It was just coordinated work with a bunch of great partners and learned so much in that campaign about how to work with other organizations, how to work with legislators, how to meet folks in community where they are and to try and find opportunities to get them involved. And, I think about a lot of the work I do now. So much of what I learned on that campaign has stayed with me through my work and how I try and continue that forward as we're, working to protect other rights that folks are care about and are really meaningful.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a lot of that work has teed you up pretty perfectly for what you're doing now. And you just naturally created this perfect segue for the rest of our conversation. I do want to start by talking about the Hands Off rally in Montpelier that happened a few days ago, because we were both there, right? And both of our organizations were organizational partners, VPIRG and ACLU. And so to me, it felt like a really cup-filling experience. We started off here at the office. We had this art build gathering, lots of sign making and just community building, and it was so great. Then we pivoted over to the State House lawn, did some tabling, and just a great opportunity to meet people where they're at, sort of like what you were saying earlier. And so I guess I'm curious if you think there will be more opportunities for Vermonters to mobilize, sort of come together and take action in the future.
Yeah, I think there needs to be. And it was a really heartening experience for a number of reasons. And one of which is it was incredible to be on the State House lawn, see 10,000 people out there, the second largest gathering I've ever been a part of there, second only to the Women's March. But the thing that I felt really inspired by was seeing just the amount of mobilization beyond Montpelier.
Right.
It was in St. Albans. It was in Brattleboro. It was on the South Royalton Green. People were turning out in their communities everywhere. And I think the estimates were something around like 23,000 people were out in the streets and protesting and making their voice heard. And one of the things that we've talked about with our national organizers and folks after the rally is this idea that you really only need about 3.5% of the population to be consistently engaged in pushing back against an authoritarian regime, for that regime to fail. And when you look at the numbers, that's about what we had here in Vermont. And so I think it was great to see this is what we need, and this needs to continue. And I'm very sure that it will. We're already hearing from folks, what are the new opportunities? And we're thinking about that. How do we keep this going? How do we keep this moving forward? Because as you know here, there's a really wide range of issues that we need to be pushing back against federal overreach on, whether it's the environment, whether it's civil rights. There's a ton of issues, and there's going to be tons of opportunity. And I think one thing that felt slightly different for me from the Women's March is, after the Women's March, there was almost a sense of like, look what we did.
Mm-hmm.
And I think rightfully, everyone was really proud. I feel like leaving that rally last on Saturday, it was kind of a sense of, all right, I'll see you next time. This is not over. This is a movement. We got to keep it going. And in some ways, it feels like it's almost been slower building. But in some ways, that also feels what's right for this moment, because it needs to be sustained. People need to do what they need to do to tap in or tap out to keep going. But, here in Vermont and around the country, it's going to be that sustained resistance and the sustained effort to stand up and push back, which is going to make the difference. And we're seeing that already, even in the first couple months of this administration, which has been so harmful. And there's going to be plenty of opportunities coming up. And, there might not be one right on the calendar where everyone's focused on right now, but I'm sure we'll have lots of opportunities in the future.
That's great to hear. And yeah, totally echoing that energy. It feels like it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're all aware of that. But regardless, it does feel like we have this lightning in a bottle energy right now. It just feels like we're really building momentum in a positive way. So that makes me feel hopeful. Sounds like you feel the same way. So I'm excited to see what comes of that. But of course, we had this rally, but that was not the only big piece of news that sort of hit Vermont over the weekend. And so many have likely heard about the detainment of the 30-year-old Turkish Tufts graduate student, Rümeysa Öztürk. And I feel like we absolutely need to talk more about that as well. So just for context for our listeners, in case they're not aware, Rümeysa was recently picked up off the street in Massachusetts by immigration agents simply because she co-authored a school op-ed. And yes, it truly was just that, completely outrageous when you think about it. And so Tufts University responded by requesting her release without delay. Again, just sharing that nothing was done to sort of cause that sort of action to her. And so what happened next, she was brought to an ICE facility here in St. Albans, Vermont. Temporarily was the intention, but it kind of got a little funky because her lawyers filed a petition at the exact same time that she was being held here in Vermont. And so what that meant was that the court case was officially then moved to this state of Vermont. And so ACLU of Vermont has joined the legal team, which I think is maybe one nice sort of silver shining light here and what I see is very tragic. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to that. What happens next and how can we support as Vermonters, Rümeysa?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I can't say a whole lot in terms of the ongoing litigation. I can say that the team that is supporting and representing her is really incredible. It includes folks from our national offices and other folks from around the country who are experts in their field and are doing great work. The high level folks are briefing the case right now. They're writing to the judge, making their best arguments. There'll be a hearing on this next week where we're going to learn more. But the goal is to get her out of detention and get her back as soon as possible, and doing everything we can. And it's and I think about kind of what can folks do. That's one of the questions I've been getting from a lot of folks. And this is one of the things that can be tricky when you're involved in the court system. You don't have the same avenues for citizen activism that you have with like a legislative hearing. The folks on the street are not meant to be influencing the decisions of the courts. But one of the things that folks can do is be really vigilant about efforts both on the state and federal level to try and restrict free speech, especially for folks who might not be U.S. citizens, because that is exactly why she was being targeted, was exercising her First Amendment right. And that has been one of our biggest fears from this administration, is how they were going to undercut our First Amendment rights and weaponize them against folks, and how they were going to erode due process. And that's one of the other major concerning things here is when you don't have due process, you can't challenge the reason for your detention. And that's where the slope gets really slippery. And it can apply to folks not just based on immigration status, could apply to U.S. citizens for using their First Amendment rights as well. Because when you don't have due process, you can't say, well, I'm a citizen, I have these rights, because you might have already been detained. You might have already been sent somewhere else. And so that's a major, major concern, and something, when our national has been talking about this case, they're pushing back on efforts in Congress. And that's why we're proactively here in the state of Vermont trying to move forward efforts that can limit any sort of information sharing with federal authorities, especially when that information is based on someone's participation in something like peaceful protest, because dissent is patriotic. It's what we should be encouraging. But when we try and regulate speech based on what someone's saying, the content of that speech, that is when we can get into real trouble. And why we as the ACLU sometimes end up in cases or supporting folks' right to speak, even though we greatly disagree with the message they're trying to convey. Because when you see attempts to regulate that speech, that can end up, based on viewpoints that you might find objectionable, it's really easy to see that weaponized, especially against folks who are already marginalized. And that's what we've seen for a number of years. So all that to say, I think the more that we can keep showing outrage about this case and keep pushing our lawmakers to make sure that we are not supporting any efforts to either initiate immigration enforcement or any other sort of criminal penalty sanction based on someone's free expression and free speech is something that we can all do, and how we can stay engaged on this.
Got it. Well, I'm so glad that ACLU is on the case. That makes me feel good because, again, I think this is just sort of a truly terrifying circumstance. And we were seeing that this kind of thing could happen, hoping it wouldn't happen. But now here we are. That's the reality. And so I want to follow this thread just a little bit more because ACLU of Vermont's efforts are focused on a broad range of issues impacting Vermonters' constitutional rights, right? You touched on that a little. I want to highlight it as a preface for this next sort of question here. And so we just learned about this again through this real life example, right, with Rümeysa. And I want to pivot just slightly to talk about immigration policy more specifically. And so S-44, an act relating to immigration agreements, was hotly debated a few weeks ago over in House Judiciary. You know this because you were there to give some witness testimony and to simply defend, First Amendment rights. Very simple and straightforward, I would think. However, that did result in House members using explicit language, sharing expressions of anger and frustration, and one House member even stormed out of the committee room altogether. And so before I ask a question to you, I'm just going to have us share a clip from that right now.
You have seen the administration actively targeting specifically college students for exercising their First Amendment right to protest based on the viewpoints that they are sharing.
I just want to be really careful because what you're testifying, taken both in this room and then obviously people that are going to be watching this and hearing about this, could be taken as supporting a terrorist organization that is operating on U.S. soil.
What we're supporting is the right to exercise free speech under and I would disagree with the characterization he's a terrorist sympathizer, and that's also our concern here. Who gets labeled a terrorist, and where does that what does that do to erode their due process right? If we are disappearing people based off their viewpoints they have expressed in public protest without due process, that is a grave concern to all of us.
I'm sorry to correct you. They did not disappear.
We are in active litigation on this.
So they are detained, but they did not.
Without due process rights.
This bill here that you're testifying on, what's this doing to protect my First Amendment rights, my children's First Amendment rights?
I care deeply about your First Amendment rights, and that's exactly what this is trying to do. When we see the erosion of First Amendment rights for anyone, it leads to a greater erosion of First Amendment rights for all of us. That's why we can't regulate speech based on what we think is appropriate or our political stances.
That line has been being crossed for years. So how are we going to do better on protecting the people that are already here legally?
I think that's exactly what I'm trying to, the language we're talking about here in terms of First Amendment protections, that's exactly what it's saying.
We've already have all this
I
stuff
apologize. I was
in place. Please sit down, because I was trying to straighten out where we were, Ken. All right, fair enough. I was just trying to get just really.
Okay, so Falko, how did S44 become such an emotional and divisive piece of legislation?
That's a really good question, because I will say I was caught off guard in that moment, because I don't think the concepts that we were putting forward were nearly as divisive or as inflammatory as apparently they were for some folks. And just a little bit of background, the bill that passed the Senate, all it says is that local law enforcement are not going to enter in collaborative agreements with immigrations and customs enforcement without the sign-off of the governor. There was a loophole in current law if there was a state of emergency declared where they could do that on their own. Underlying bill says we shouldn't do that. But since this conversation started back in November, we've been asking for folks to expand the protections that exist within that statute, which are currently to stop any sort of registry for folks based off of their religious affiliation. This was passed in 2017 as a way to combat the proposed Muslim ban. And what we've been saying is we know what the threats to the Trump administration are going to look like, and we know the populations that are going to be targeted. And so we are asking lawmakers to expand the protections in terms of limiting information sharing from the state to the feds when it relates to folks getting legally protected health care, which is abortion care, gender-affirming care, folks exercising their First Amendment rights, or when it comes to immigration enforcement, which is not something the state of Vermont does. Immigration status is not something that is delineated in Vermont law, and not something that that Vermont law enforcement should be spending time and resources enforcing. In our testimony, we didn't even get to the section discussing limiting contact with immigration enforcement. It was mostly focused on our our advocacy for folks' right to express themselves under the First Amendment, and things went awry when people tried to equate our advocacy for the First Amendment with supporting domestic terrorism, which I think rightfully took exception to. And things kind of went off the rails from there. And one of the things that I was trying to convey to folks is when we're protecting people's First Amendment rights, that applies to everyone. If we're protecting the right to speak today for one group of people, that's going to protect your right to speak tomorrow if you have a different disagreement. And that is part of the ACLU's mission and why free speech cases have been central to a lot of the work that we've been doing for years. But I also, it's been an interesting experience. I've been testifying and working in that building in one way or another for 16 years at this point. I've never experienced anything like that on the stand. I've also never experienced the the reaction that I've had to that. I've had more people talk to me about that piece of testimony than possibly anything else I've ever done in that building. And I think folks were rightfully really shocked and horrified because it was not a conversation that was based on the merits. There was a lot of inflammatory national rhetoric brought in, and things that were at play maybe outside of what I knew walking into that committee. But my bigger fear is that folks that stops folks from wanting to engage in the process and engage with the legislature. And that's one of the bigger fears I've heard from folks who've seen that is how could that happen? Folks have been asking me, are you okay? And I am fine. In some ways, I relish the opportunity to be in that seat and to push back. It's a privilege. Honestly, it's a privilege to be able to do this work for the ACLU and to be in that room and to feel like I had the opportunity to combat some of the misinformation and misconceptions I was hearing. But we want everyone in the state to feel comfortable being in that building and to make their voices heard to decision makers. So I think it does open a larger conversation. How do we make sure that we maintain the decorum that we should so that everyone feels comfortable in there raising their voice, especially folks who might come from different backgrounds, hold different identities, because that is a problem up there. It has been a problem. And, I don't want other folks to have to face that type of hostility, which I faced. And I'm, in some ways glad we were able to draw it out. And hopefully this lifts up this bill and makes it more visible to folks and is something that we can see move forward in the legislature this year. Because as we were saying, what we're trying to do is to make sure we're focusing our state's resources on what's best for Vermonters. We have limited resources. We have to choose how we use them. We shouldn't be using them to support either federal immigration enforcement or federal overreach into things like a protected First Amendment speech or our protected right to health care. So we're hoping we can see that get over the line this year, along with a number of other different bills that we're watching. The ACLU here in Vermont and nationally launched an initiative called the Firewall for Freedom, where we are trying to work in states where there's an opportunity to put in place more protections for folks. So that's something on our website I can send folks to. There's a number of bills that we are supporting, a number of bills that are being advanced by our other partners in a wide range of issues, largely trying to protect LGBTQ plus communities, immigrant communities, and folks accessing, legally protected healthcare, such as reproductive health care and gender affirming care. So those are a number of the pieces of legislation we're trying to move forward, and we see folks in other states around the country trying to move forward where they have more opportunities and more receptive legislatures. So it's part of the mix. It's part of what we want to see move forward. But, hopefully, I'm hoping that was a one-off and it's not something we see more of within the legislature. And I'm glad in some ways that it got as much attention as it did, because hopefully that can help correct some behavior. It's not something other folks have to go through.
Yeah, I sure hope so, because even just watching the recording on YouTube, it was about an hour long, my stomach was churning. So personally, I can't imagine being in the seat that you were in. And I'm glad that you were able to handle it so well, and you're glad that you were there. So I'm grateful.
Thank you.
But yeah, I imagine that would make a lot of folks really uncomfortable to be in such a hostile environment like that. So I agree with the sentiment. I hope that it changes. And you spoke about a lot of opportunities to see some legislation through. Is it useful for our listeners to possibly reach out to their representatives? I mean, is there a call to action at this moment?
Yeah, on that bill in particular, we have a way for you to contact your representatives, ask them to pass S44 with our proposed amendments, and we'll share the link with you to make sure it might be up on the screen right now. If not, we'll find a way to get that in the show notes. So that folks can take that action along with other ones and find out the work that we're doing. But, that still has an opportunity to make it through this year. The underlying bill in itself is something we're very supportive of, but I think it could go further and protect more folks.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So to me, it's clear that it is imperative that we continue to support our immigrant communities here in Vermont. And I'm glad that folks like you are working so diligently on that. Of course, I do want to mention that there are other folks in Vermont that need additional support as well. And so what I'm thinking about is how this spring, 1,000 people will become unsheltered due to the recent executive order by Governor Phil Scott. And so ACLU of Vermont stated online, this is a predictable and manufactured crisis, one that leaves Vermont's towns and cities to manage the consequences of a statewide housing shortage and policy failure. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah. I think that the place to start is just affirming that housing is a human right. Everyone deserves to have a safe place to lay their head at the end of the day, and no one should be put out into the cold unless they want to be out there. And what we've seen since the start of the pandemic and moving forward is a real shifting landscape in the government's responsibility to make sure that folks have access to shelter. It was great to see the expansion of our general assistance program throughout the pandemic and seeing folks who needed shelter have the ability to access it, because we understood what a public health crisis homelessness can be and the downstream impacts that has on all of our health and all of our communities. But it has been really concerning moving forward, the sustained and continued efforts, especially from the Scott administration, as well as some in the legislature, to roll back those programs and protections and to continually say there's only, making the group of folks that they think are deserving to have shelter smaller and smaller and smaller. And we've seen waves of these evictions where you see folks, with almost no notice being put out on the streets with their stuff in shopping bags trying to figure out where they're going to go. We've seen people die in the woods because they did not have access to shelter. And it's really concerning where this conversation is going and some of the rhetoric that we've heard within the State House. And in many ways, I find it very hard to explain why the governor is so dead set on making sure that we keep pushing people out onto the streets from this program, which might not be perfect, but it's better than the alternative at this point in time. And I don't think anyone is saying we should be permanently housing folks in motels and just, keeping them there and not asking any questions. I think everyone agrees we need a comprehensive system of shelter with wraparound supports and services that allows for more tailored response and a continuum of care for folks who might have really complex needs beyond just a lack of shelter. Things like, folks dealing with mental health conditions, folks dealing with substance abuse disorder. And there does need to be more comprehensive response to that. But until we have that, until we have the shelter capacity to make sure that everyone can be have a safe place to lay their head at the end of the day, we can't just be putting folks out on the street. And I think this most recent round of evictions was especially troubling because it was not going to cost the government any more money than they'd already budgeted. We, not to get too wonky about it, but we came into the budget adjustment, which is where you say, all right, here's what we said we're going to spend. Here's how much we've spent. Here's what's left. And there was money left over from what was already appropriated that could have kept the folks who were already determined to be the most vulnerable housed until we were able to pass a new budget. And the governor just kept saying, no, 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 no. I don't think these people are deserving enough. We need to be having a conversation of who is the most deserving. Is a person in their third trimester more deserving than someone who's fleeing domestic violence? Is someone with severe medical needs more vulnerable and more deserving than someone who lost their house in the flood? These are the wrong conversations to be having, where we try and draw that circle tighter and tighter and put more and more people out in the cold because we think someone is deserving of supports. We know the long-term and lasting impacts that come from people experiencing homelessness. And in our work, this is especially concerning because we have the fourth highest rate of homelessness in the country. And when you look in our communities, a lot of the concern that folks have for public safety comes from the fact that they see people on the street and those people are struggling. And that's right to be concerned. But we've also seen that the response from that has been more of a reliance on over-incarceration and the criminal legal system, which is not how people get help. That's not how people get better. Longer prison sentences don't really rehabilitate folks. Longer, possible threats of jail time don't deter crime. And so we need to think more comprehensively about how can we address these needs? How can we put a system in place that meets the needs of folks and helps them through that journey? So that's part of why we're supporting H91, a bill moving through the legislature right now that is aiming to create a more comprehensive system, create a continuum of care. And so we hope folks will join us in supporting that. We're also concerned that the governor will once again come in and try and put unrealistic and sometimes cases really cruel limits on who can access that shelter through those programs, when that should be something that's worked out between providers and the folks that they're serving, as well as making sure that there's enough funds available. So we have pushed back strongly every single time that we've seen folks unnecessarily exited from shelter when they have no place else to go, especially when the response to that is, well, we'll stand up these shelters that are more costly and less effective and aren't serving folks effectively. The response has not been well thought out and in many ways has been harmful. And we hope that we can find a path forward in the future where we agree no one wants folks sleeping out on the street. And we want to make sure they have supports and services they need so that they can get themselves back on their feet with the help that they need, the wraparound services and support. So it's concerning. It's a pattern that I think is troubling to a lot of folks, especially folks who think of the governor as as Mr. Nice Guy. And his actions when it comes to folks who are unhoused have really run counter to that narrative I think a lot of Vermonters have been.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's tragic. And so what I'm hearing is that listeners can reach out about this bill. You said H91? H91. Though, of course, there are still some concerns regarding the governor. So for me, living in Berry City, I often see calls to action about just sharing resources, materials to churches, shelters, etc. Is that another avenue where Vermonters can provide support? I'm just thinking of this interim moment where we're trying to find the correct solution and we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I think relying on community supports and services, sharing that up for folks who might need them, and then also just plain and simple, calling the governor, writing the governor, and telling that everyone should be sheltered is what you can do right now. We know that the pressure has an impact, and the governor, in many ways, is the sticking point on this right now. So the more folks that can be writing and sharing their thoughts with the governor, that we need to make sure that everyone has access to shelter now. Can be really helpful as we come into some of the negotiations conversations that are going to happen at the end of the session.
Good to know. And it seems to me like it's not just your organization that's feeling frustrated by all of this. In fact, last week, 119 Vermont organizations, including yours, came together in coalition to call on local lawmakers and the governor to better defend Vermont's rights and democracy. So I'm curious about this. What does success look like for you in this scenario, and how do you plan to continue applying pressure moving forward?
Yeah, success is going to be something we see over time. As we talked about before, it's not going to be just one moment. And I think a lot of it is going to be building up those muscles to fight back when we are challenged as a state. And I know just from the email alerts I get from BPIRG, this is happening in a number of spaces. This is happening with, the federal government pushing back on landmark environmental policies, making big polluters pay. It's happening in the educational space where the federal government is trying to tell the state they need to certify that we won't do any sort of training, diversity, equity, and inclusion, when that's in fact our state law, and we're going to continue to do it. And so in many ways, the goal of that letter was, one, to show lawmakers and other elected officials that this is where Vermonters are. Vermonters want them standing up, and they want them fighting back, and that we're going to have their back when they do it. And so I think success is going to look like seeing our leaders continue to push back when those moments come. And we can't predict all of them. We can see a lot of them coming. And so it's building up some of those muscles. I think it's also success looks like more and more folks joining on that letter. It's an open letter. It's not closed. We also have opportunities for individuals to send that same language to their elected officials, who, if you aren't representing an organization, that's something you can send your elected officials today. And so I think seeing more folks join on to that, and then not just letting that sit as a list, but seeing that as an opportunity to continue to engage these folks, these pillars in our community, to speak up and speak out, both on the local level with the decision makers that matter there, and then use their influence statewide and with our congressional delegation. Luckily, our delegation is pretty in line with pretty much everything we are asking for, but there's going to be some hard choices as a state moving forward. And how do we protect our values in the face of some of the threats we're going to be seeing? It's also important to remember, just because Donald Trump says he can do something doesn't mean that's true. That's why we've sued him dozens of times since the start of this administration already, because time and again, he's exceeding his legal bounds and what he can do, and just trying to bully and scare people into capitulating with what he wants. And so we need to develop those reflexes where when, we are seeing that federal overreach, we can take a second, we can ground ourselves in our values and the community we have here to support ourselves, and find ways to push back and then support each other in those efforts, because it might not always be easy, and we have to be clear-eyed about what those consequences might be. But I think we're hearing from folks loud and clear, we're not going down without a fight. And that's what we saw in the rallies this weekend. And I think that's where many Vermonters are right now, is they're ready to engage that fight and do what they can to help protect our state, protect our values, and protect the rights that everyone calls their state home.
Well, that really sounds good to me. I'm on board. So, Falko, I so appreciate all of the work that you're doing and everything that we've discussed today, and just want to recognize that you're probably doing a whole lot more than we even talked about. So I just want to give you the opportunity to lift up anything else about you, your work, ACLU's work, anything that you think our listeners should know.
I feel like I probably should have thought a little bit more and come with a whole spiel about all the different things that we're doing. Okay. But I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you. And I also really appreciate the opportunity to work in coalition with organizations like VPIRG and many others who are standing up. I would say, check out that sign-on letter. Check out opportunities at acluvt.org/act, which is where we have all of our actions out there. we're working on things like housing access for immigrant families. We're working on limiting information sharing with the federal government. We're working on things like raising the age for juveniles in the criminal legal system. Our landmark campaign that we've been working on for years is the Smart Justice Vermont campaign, trying to reduce our prison population by half from our peak and then combat the racial disparities that exist in that criminal legal system, since they're some of the worst in the country. So it's a wide range of work. And if anyone's really interested, we hope you come and join us over at the ACLU, get involved, sign up for our emails. We'd love to have you. And I really appreciate all the support that we have been feeling. That's one thing that I just want to echo out is working at the ACLU over the last couple of months has not necessarily been easy. The challenges are big. You're having to pivot on a moment's notice and deal with things you wish we weren't having to deal with. But we have been feeling so much love and support from folks, and it helps us keep going every single day. As we know that we're trying to do the work that folks want us to do out there, and I think there is an opportunity to, here within this state, really grow these movements, connect our movements, find the intersectionality in our work, and show that we're really stronger together. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and thanks for looking to the bright side. It's a great way to close out this conversation.
You got to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, really appreciate your time today. I know you're busy. I'll let you get back to it, but looking forward to seeing what comes next for you.
All right. Thank you so much.
And that's our episode. Thank you so much to Falko for taking the time to be here today. As always, if you would like to learn more about anything we discussed, you should check out the description box for extra links, and also get on VPIRG's mailing list, check us out online, and get on our social media pages. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars. If you have ideas for future episodes or questions, comments, concerns, reach out to me at jheiden@vpirg.org. That's JHEIDEN@vpirg.org. As always, I'd like to give a special thank you to my co-producer, Elijah Cushion. I'm Jordan Hayden, and you've been listening to Vermont's Voice.